last speaker for the morning, Jean-Pascal Anfray. Jean-Pascal is associate professor at the École Normale Supérieure. He works on early modern and late medieval philosophy and metaphysics. He's the author of a great book, Qu'est-ce que la nécessité, 2009, and he has published several articles and book chapters, especially on Scotus, Molina, Descartes, and Leibniz. So please, Jean-Pascal, give us your lights on Suárez and the notion of a free course.
Okay, thank you very much. So I need to say first that my topic is a bit tangential to the scope of this conference, as it is, as you indicated, mainly historical. And even sometimes I will tackle some obscure and outdated pieces of metaphysics and philosophy of mind. So parts of what I say will seem strange to most contemporary philosophers. But other parts, I hope so, will show that there are very close connections between some recent developments in the discussions about agent causation and Suárez's own metaphysical conception of what a free cause is. The problem of free will includes a practical as well as a metaphysical component, and the latter is not neutral with respect to the first. In a recent paper, Tim O'Connor and John Jacobs rightly underscored this. More precisely, they develop a so-called neo-Aristotelian metaphysics, which serves as a metaphysical framework for their agent causation view. Some views of agent causation rest on a dualistic conception of causation, where the causes of natural events are events and free actions involve a special kind of causation by an agent, involving new kind of causation in addition to the usual event causation. The neo-Aristotelian view is simpler insofar as all causation comes down to substance causation. That is, substances have powers, and all and only substances are causes of effects of various kinds, and substances cause such effects through their exercising of their own powers for effects of such and such kinds. This view rests in turn on the idea that agents are genuine substances and that they are ontologically fundamental. However, since all causation in this view is substance causation, the distinction between free agents and unfree causes or unfree agents cannot rest on the nature of the causal relata and has to do with the specific role of reasons and the fact that agent causes are intrinsically purposive. The specificity of a free agent thus turns on the kind of substance the agent is and its ontological status, and an emergent substance endowed with a top-down active causal power, which is intrinsically purposive. My aim here is to use this approach as a tool for understanding Suárez's account of free cause, which can be uncontroversially counted among agent causal views of free will. The Jesuit thinker shares with O'Connor a similar, basically Aristotelian metaphysical framework, but his metaphysics of causation and substantial forms represents a form of Aristotelianism typical of late scholastic philosophy. A well-known feature of this framework is a marked tendency to the reification of faculties and powers scorned by early modern philosophers. On the other hand, this realist framework leads Suárez to take great care in the analysis of agent causation, and for this reason, I think, a study of his views is still rewarding from a philosophical point of view. As a guiding thread, I will start from the various denotations of the notion of a free cause. The identity of a free cause is diversely specified. Sometimes Suárez claims that it can refer to a human being or to the soul, which is the substantial form of a human being, and finally to an active power or a specific faculty of the soul. In this latter case, Suárez claims that the will is the single free power and that free will, or liberum arbitrium, is properly or formally a property of the will or rational appetite. Does anything substantial hinge on this terminological variations beyond mere conventions. Which of the denotations of free cause is more basic? I think there's a substantial problem here. Indeed, within the hylomorphic framework defended by Suárez, a human being is a composite corporal substance endowed with a soul, which is a substantial form and is united to a certain quantity or part of matter. But a human being is a free cause only insofar as it is endowed with this rational soul, which thus can be considered as the basic agent. Moreover, the soul is a free cause only insofar as it is endowed with this special faculty, the will, as well as with other distinct faculties, in particular the intellect. But Suárez holds that the soul's faculties are really distinct from each other. Now, if these faculties are really distinct, then it seems that, in particular, the intellect and will would, so it seems, operate as distinct causal agents, coordinated more or less tightly within the same causal network provided by the substance or the substantial form. But then one loses sight of a fully integrated agent. And this suggests Locke's famous objection that any realist theory of the faculties opens the way to a multiplication of distinct agents, subagents, or homunculi. More specifically, in the case of free will, the metaphysical complexity of the soul seems to be incompatible with the kind of control required for freedom and moral responsibility. Thus, Suárez's view faces the problem of rationality and control. Because if you consider the will as set off from reasons and motives, it appears as a mere random device or randomizing device. And if nothing determines the agent to exercise his agent causal power, which is the will, in a particular way, then any action determined by the agent in this way will be indistinguishable from a mere chance happening. Again, this view raises the problem of practical rationality. If the will is basically the free cause, its two-way power looks like a power to act irrationally against what the intellect proposes. The agent causal model thus seems not to be unable to account for the influence of reasons. And it must be said that Suárez provides grist for such objections when he, for instance, calls the will, considered as an isolated faculty, a blind power. The will, thus, considered as a quasi-agent, would not differ from as a so-called randomizing device. So, in the following, I will tackle three questions. How is free causation or agent causation related to efficient causation in general for Suárez? Then, what is his account of the nature of the soul as an agent? And finally, how does his account of a free cause cope with the problem of rationality and control? But first, I will present a quick overview of his theory of free will. Very sketchy elements of his overall view. So Suárez distinguishes among causes necessary and necessary cause and free causes. Necessary causes are determined to one course of action in given circumstances. Agents who lack the use of reason are all necessary causes. Conversely, all and only rational causes are free causes. By contrast with necessary causes, free causes operate contingently and are not determined to one course of action. They are such that given all the requisites for doing some action A, they can either do A or refrain from doing A, where doing here is restricted to a very basic class of action, namely acts of choosing or deciding, and not the ensuing external action. Freedom, as understood by Suárez, is thus incompatible with metaphysical and causal determinism. In addition, freedom involves rationality and openness to alternatives. In the handout I just mentioned, because that was in connection with the preceding talk, the specific proof of freedom, which is based on inner awareness, of a kind of agential control. But this is not directly connected to my main topic, so I skip this. The existence of free action entails the existence of a free power or faculty, which is defined by Suárez as both an active power and a two-way power. This power is the will, and on this course, Suárez aligns himself with the Scottish tradition and departs from the more Aristotelian Thomist tradition. According to the Thomists, the intellect is the root of free will in the sense that the indetermination of the will stems from the indetermination of the reasons proposed by the judgments of the intellect. More technically, the indifference of our will depends on the indifference of the practical judgment of the intellect. It is thus, according to the Thomists, the multiplicity of finite goods which endows the will with its capacity to sometimes will some action and be able to refrain from willing it. According to Suárez, the will admittedly presupposes such judgments and cannot act without being presented with a given reason for an action. The will is thus essentially responsive to reasons, but these reasons are insufficient to determine the will's choice. According to Suárez, the will has a two-way power, endows the agent with three kinds of freedom or so-called indifference, three ways of exercising these two-way powers. Thus, free agents enjoy freedom of exercise because they're indifferent with respect to the exercise of their will. A free cause can either will some action or refrain from willing it. I can either will to read a novel or not read it. They're also indifferent or free with respect to the specification of the object of their act. I can either read a novel or an essay. Finally, they're indifferent with respect to the specification of their attitude toward this object. I can either love or hate a certain book or novel, for instance. So the first kind of indifference, that is the freedom of exercise, is essential to the freedom of the will and is always present, even though in the normal cases we also enjoy freedom of specification. So much for the general overview. Now, let's turn to the specific theory of causation. Free and necessary causes are, as I said, both instances of efficient causation. Efficient causes are substances endowed with a power whose manifestation is the effect produced by the agent. This effect is produced in a recipient endowed with the correlative passive power of receiving the action of the active cause or suppositum. Substances do not always act, but only when some conditions are given. These conditions are the so-called requisites of action. In the case of natural or necessary causes, Suárez provides a list of such requisites. First, the agent's active power requires a patient on which to produce its effect. Second, this patient must be sufficiently close and endowed with a correlative passive power. And also, there must be no impeding causes activated at the time. And finally, in the broadly theist framework of Suárez, the concurrence of God or the first cause is required. What is very important is that these requisites are neither causes nor even partial causes, but merely necessary conditions. As Tim said earlier this morning, they could be compared to external necessary manifestation conditions. In this analysis, the active part of a relation of efficient causation includes two items: the agent, properly speaking, and the power through which it operates. To characterize the relation between these two elements, Suárez uses a distinction between principles ut quod, in Latin, literally principles that which, and principles ut quo, that is, principles literally that in virtue of which. The ut quod principle corresponds to the agent, whereas the power or faculty specifying the action corresponds to the ut quo principle. Now, when one speaks of the principal cause of an effect, according to Suárez, one refers to the principal quad, namely the agent, which is the substance, and more properly to that in virtue of which the substance is active, its substantial form. This means that powers are not agents by themselves, but are essentially attributed to agents. In turn, such powers correspond to properties or accidental forms. Such accidental forms lack causal activity of themselves and acquire the ability to produce an effect only in virtue of being forms attributed to a substantial form or a powerful agent. But these powers, considered as principle ut quo, specify the kind of causal activity exerted by the substantial form which would otherwise be indeterminate. In this respect, powers can also be considered as principal causes, according to Suárez. For instance, an artist's ability of sculpting is a principal cause of the sculpture, but the artist, that is the substance, is the agent or the principal cause ut quod of this sculpture. This means that an agent can be an efficient cause of a given effect only if it is endowed with a specific power and not merely as a bare subject. Now, things look straightforward, yet there is a tension within this theory, potential tension due to just the mere terminological fact that principal cause can refer either to the substance or substantial form on the one hand and to the powers on the other hand. Because even if the official theory of efficient causality is a substance cause theory, some of what Suárez writes at some points rather evokes some kind of res or power causality where powers do the real causal job and substances are reduced to the role of being mere substrata or mere bundles of powers. For instance, heat is an accidental form whose manifestation can be produced in different subjects. And heat, according to the Aristotelian framework of Suárez, as it is in fire, can produce heat in the water contained in my kettle. But hot water is also able to heat the ambient air. So one and the same type of power produces the same type of effects in distinct subjects. This suggests that powers produce their manifestations as their effects directly through themselves. Suárez is led to accept this consequence because of some reasons that are connected with theology. And the Eucharist is an important issue here because, just very quickly, if you consider that in the Eucharist the substance of the bread disappears and is replaced by Christ's body, then the species of bread remains, but not only its species, its causal powers, as for instance the causal power of nourishing the believer who takes the consecrated bread. Thus, if God conserves the nutritive power separately from the substantial form, the power seems to be causally potent still. And so powers could be considered as genuine causes. However, such extraordinary possibilities can occur only with respect to a restricted class of powers, what Suárez calls non-vital powers. By contrast, the vital powers, namely powers and faculties of living substances, are intrinsically tied to their substantial forms and cannot act independently of these, even through God's omnipotence. For instance, in the place of his commentary on De Anima, Suárez considers the possibility that God prevents what he calls the natural emanation of the soul's faculties, in particular the intellect. The soul would continue to exist without its faculties, which proves that there is a real distinction between the soul and its powers, according to Suárez. And in a case like this, Suárez claims that the soul would be unable to think, which shows that powers are irreducible. Yet more importantly, even if we added the supposition that God supernaturally conserved the faculty of the intellect, that is the power itself, without the underlying agent, then, according to Suárez, the faculty would be unable to produce its characteristic manifestation. The intellect cannot think in the absence of a thinking agent. So, in the case of living beings in general, Suárez claims that there is an intrinsic dependence of the operation of the faculty upon the activity of the substantial form, which is the only active principle. Therefore, vital powers are they are strictly not autonomous sub-agents, but essentially involve the activity of the soul. For this reason, when it comes to identifying the principles of a free action, Suárez claims that the principal, ut quod, refers to man, and that the principles, ut quo, that in virtue of which, refers not to the will, but to the rational soul, which is the substantial form. The will is then, in man, only the proximate principle, ut quo, of the free action. It means that the will is not the agent, and that, properly speaking, the cause of the volition is the rational soul, in virtue of having a will as one of its powers or faculties. To use a metaphor, vital powers specify the causal energy provided by the substantial form, but their causal role is that of mere instruments. There is thus an important distinction between two types of efficient causation. Efficient causation as it occurs in non-living beings, which covers case as non-vital actions, and efficient causation in living beings, which produce their own vital actions. In the case of non-vital actions, a substance can produce an effect on a passive power of a distinct substance. And so these powers are intrinsically powers of causing transitive actions. For example, the fire, through its heat, warms the water in the kettle, and this is a case of a transitive, non-vital action. By contrast, vital actions are necessarily produced by the powers of a single substance. More precisely, the resulting acts of vital actions are efficiently produced by their powers. They are immanent acts that remain located in these powers. They exist literally in the soul, and more precisely in the powers through which they were activated. So, crucial here is the fact that, according to Suárez, I quote, "The action of a vital power does not produce the vital action of another power." This means not only that vital actions cannot be efficiently caused by external agents, but also, more strongly, that there are no direct efficient causations, a case of efficient causation of a vital action by a distinct power of the same agent, in the same agent. However, the fact that vital actions are neither efficiently caused by external substances nor by distinct powers of the same substance does not preclude their being possibly determined by either external conditions or other vital actions caused by distinct powers. In both cases, Suárez uses the same terminology. He speaks of a vital power as being excited or applied, or applicatus, to its proper action. I read the passage in this section of the handout. "In the second way, the powers of the soul are stimulated through a quasi-moral efficient causality because of the natural sympathy they have in virtue of their being rooted in the same essence of the soul and ordered to one another. This type of stimulation is also standardly called the movement or application of one power by another." This is the way that the will is said to move all the powers of the soul. So, at first sight, all such non-causal connections could be assimilated to triggering factors. But the idea of applying a faculty to its operation refers to a non-causal connection between a certain condition, external necessary condition, and the activity of a vital power. Suárez applies it indifferently to the relation between an external requisite and the power of the soul, and to the relation between different powers, the activities of different powers within the same soul. However, these two relations involve different causal frameworks. Because when it obtains between an external condition and a faculty, as for instance in the case of sensation, where the object of sensation and the medium do not properly cause the act of sensation, according to Suárez, but serve merely as necessary conditions that determine the sensory power to produce a given sensation, in such case, there's a non-causal but necessary correlation between the obtaining of the condition and the causal activity of the substance. And this fact is not grounded in anything else than the general order of nature as it is set by God's will. It needs no further grounding. On the other hand, when the connection obtains between the actions of distinct vital powers, as for instance between the imagination in the intellect in the formation of concepts, or between the intellect and will in free causation, in those cases there's a non-causal coordination between the faculty that is characterized in terms of what, as I read in the quote, sympathy, coordination, harmony, concord. These are synonyms variously used by Suárez. What to make of this mysterious idea of a sympathy between the faculties? The point is that this does not describe a brute fact, but always points to a grounding of the activities of the substance of the powers within the same agent. Suárez argues in the following way: the faculties of the soul display separate activities. However, these activities do not work randomly. The will elicits an act of volition only when there is a prior cognitive action. This coordinated working of the faculties cannot be a brute primitive fact. It needs a grounding, and this grounding is secured by the causal activity of the same substantial form which underlies both faculties. And now, what is the precise nature of this involvement? Suárez envisages and rejects a weak proposal, namely that the influence of the soul is exhausted by the fact that the faculties themselves are caused to exist through the causal influence of the soul, and that in turn these faculties operate autonomously. Such rootedness, or what he calls in Latin habitualis radicatio, can only account for the order of dependence among the faculties themselves, but it cannot account for the order between the actions and activities of these faculties. A volition is caused when and only when the object of this volition is first represented by the intellect. Such functional dependence among the vital operations need an explanation which, to use a metaphor, is not horizontal but vertical. The functional dependence, as I said, is explained by the fact that one and the same substantial form efficiently causes the act of the intellect and the volition. How does it work specifically in the case of the intellect and will? Well, I quote here a passage which appears in the handout and on top of page 3. Suárez says, we can more easily avoid these problems by denying the active concurrence of cognition with the act of appetite, maintaining that through representing an object it merely provides a condition after which the appetite produces its act through the natural sympathy between these powers, to which these powers, being rooted in the same soul, best contributes. The soul or the subject through the soul or the subject through is that which principally operates and uses these powers, and thus, when it perceives an object agreeable to it by one power, it strives for it by the other, not through effecting on one by another, but because when it perceives the object through one power, it is excited to operate through the other. This excitement does not result from a real and effective mutation, but from a metaphorical or final one, thus not requiring a local propinquity, but merely that of the soul. This way, it is possible to say that the will is moved by reasons, or that the judgment of the intellect motivates the will, which is thus a rational power. Such motion is not a case of efficient causation. It is described as a metaphorical motion, or again, an objective motion, that is, a motion through the representational content of the judgment of the intellect. Such phrases are another name for the final causality. Final causality, according to Suárez, is metaphorical, not because it is unreal, but because it describes the motion caused by some object represented as good. And but what efficiently causes something is not the intellect or its judgment. It is only the soul itself. I have thus identified a necessary condition for being a free cause. A free agent must be endowed with active, vital powers. But the will is also a two-way power, and neither being an active power nor being a vital power is sufficient for qualifying as such. However, the theory of vital powers provides Suárez with an interesting way out of the problems faced by libertarian theories of agent causation, namely the problems of rationality and control. The will, the problem, to put it very easily, is that given that the will is a two-way power, even if the set of absolutely necessary condition obtains, the agent can act one way or another. Which way the agent acts is not determined by the obtaining of the prior conditions, and this raises, in particular, the problem of rationality and control. Suárez's discussion of these problems is framed in terms of the influence of the practical judgment on the will. Against the Thomists, he claims that although in order to choose an object X there is necessarily a prior judgment that X is good, nevertheless the judgment does not necessitate the choice of the will. In slogan form, Suárez says, the will is determined by the intellect with respect to sufficiency, but it determines itself with respect to efficacy. I will try in the remaining minutes to uncover what this slogan means. Suárez considers various situations involving a practical judgment and the choice of the will. First, he considers a situation where there is a single practical judgment that some course of action is good. Second, he considers situations where we have comparative practical judgments concerning the relative goodness of a plurality of options. With respect to comparative practical judgments, there are also two sub-cases. Case one, which can be described as Buridan cases, where the comparative judgment represents the alternatives as approximately equally good and equally bad, and the second kind of case where the comparative practical judgment represents one option as definitely better than any other. With respect to the first case, Suárez unequivocally claims that the will is absolutely free to choose either course of action. With respect to the second case, he maintains that the will can choose contrary to the option represented as better, although most of the time the will chooses in accordance with the action represented as more valuable by the comparative judgment. And Suárez extends this answer to cases where the will is presented with a single non-comparative judgment. Then the will is not necessitated to choose in accordance to what the intellect presents because, according to Suárez, the will can, more properly, the agent can suspend the action of the will and move the intellect to consider another object or to re-evaluate the goodness of this object. So, Suárez's answer to cases of type 2 seems incompatible with the rationality of our actions, since it opens the possibility that the will acts against the best reasons. And his answer to cases of type 1 is incompatible with the demand that genuine reason explanations be contrastive. So he seems to be in a real quandary. As I have not much time, how much time do I still have?
Well, you can 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, okay. So maybe a small detour through two contemporary answers to this problem, to this rationality problem. First, there's Randolph Clark, who has proposed an integrated account according to which a free decision is caused by two distinct factors: the reasons on the one hand, a belief-desire complex, and the agent-causal power on the other hand. Both factors contribute to the obtaining of the action as an effect. But how do these reasons influence the agent-causal power? Clark claims that when the agent causes the decision, she causes this decision for some of the reasons considered. Now, the problem is restated. How can the agent weigh reasons without being causally influenced by them in turn? The further part of Clark's answer is to postulate a correspondence between the propensities of an agent to cause an action and the weight or propensities of her reasons for acting. But according to an objection raised by Dirk Perboom, this account raises two problems. First, this solution leaves large unexplained or brute coincidences. Second, such correspondence does not provide the right sort of relation between an agent and the reasons of her action. Tim O'Connor has elaborated an alternative model. On this account, agent-causal powers are uncaused, yet they are structured by the agent's motivational states. The agent's power to act on reason is built into the agent-causal power itself as a kind of structural as opposed to triggering cause. More precisely, to quote O'Connor, motivational states act causally on the persisting capacity of an agent freely to form an intention to act, altering the objective strengths or generating the dispositions the agent has to form specific intentions within certain intervals. Reasons thus provide the agents with new powers of choice and action, distinct reasons having the potential to motivate to different action types. Such powers are transitory and they modify the one persistent agent-causal power by altering its inclination towards its manifestation. Then, on O'Connor's account, the reasons and the agent-causal power are not two distinct entities, but the reasons are integrated as a component of the agent-causal power itself. The power to act on reasons is thus built into this agent-causal power itself. As a solution to the problem of the lack of rational explanation in particular, Tim offers the following example. Suppose I'm deliberating as to what to do on Saturday afternoon. I am disposed with a strength of 0.3 to help a friend repair her deck, and I am disposed with a strength of 0.7 to watch a football game instead. Suppose further that I choose to help my friend. Then the question is, why did I so choose? And the answer, I so chose because I was motivated by the reasons favoring my helping my friend. According to O'Connor, then, this is a perfectly good explanation in spite of the fact that it's not a contrastive explanation. And yet, there's nothing mysterious here, since it is also the case with any kind of probabilistic explanations. With this in mind, I think it's now time to turn back to Suárez. So, the rationality objection against his account of free will rests on two assumptions. The first is that explanations always need to be contrastive, and the second is that the reasons motivate the will independently of it, namely that the will has no control over what counts as a motivating reason. Against the first assumption, Suárez opposes a weaker conception of practical rationality as based on good enough reasons. It is rational for some agent to choose A just in case she has a practical judgment that A is good in some respect. In particular, free choice does not require an all things considered comparative judgment involving that what is chosen is better than any other considered alternative, because this would entail the necessitation of the will by the practical judgment. Thus, Suárez claims that when confronted with reasons of unequal weight, there's a rational explanation of the action just because the agent had some reason to will it and acted on this reason, even if she had an antecedently stronger inclination or was antecedently more strongly motivated by another reason. Also, Suárez rejects the second assumption. Indeed, if, according to Suárez, the practical judgments of the intellect were intrinsically motivational, then by choosing against what a comparative judgment represents as best, the agent would act irrationally. However, it is only through the choice of the will that what is represented as good by the intellect acquires a motivational force, according to Suárez. This excludes that reasons influence choices through efficient causation, and it shows that the metaphorical motion, which is characteristic of final causality and motivation by reasons, has two components, namely a representational and normative component, the representation of an object as good under some respect, and a strictly motivational component, whereby the object motivates the will to choose this precise object. And the claim, the central claim, is that the motivational component depends on the agent. What justifies this claim is that a good represented by the intellect motivates the will only given the prior condition that the will pursues some end through this good. In his moral psychology, Suárez stresses that this commitment to the pursuit of an end, what he calls intentio finis, is always, so to say, virtually involved in the actual choice of any good. So, an agent is free to choose X only if he is free to will the end Y to which X is connected as means. And freedom being, so to say, closed under entailment, the agent can will not to be motivated by this end, by Y, if he is free to choose X. So, when an agent chooses a definite course of action, this choice involves an ordering of the ends pursued by the will and thereby of the motivational force of reasons. Generally, one chooses according to what agrees more with an antecedently determined end. But in some cases, as in temptations or moral dilemmas, one's choice involved, so to say, a resetting of these ends during the deliberation process, and thereby of the weight of reasons through the act of choice. This solution, and this will, I think, conclude with this remark, this solution to the challenge of rational explanation rests on the metaphysics of the soul and its faculties. Indeed, in order to account for the fact that the will is both prior and posterior to the practical judgment, Suárez invokes the very natural sympathy of the faculties that I tried to explain earlier. At first sight, it could seem that invoking such a natural sympathy or harmony between the practical judgment and the actual choice amounts to postulating a brute correspondence, as in Randolph Clark's integrationist account. However, we have seen that the core element in Suárez's conception of sympathy is that this functional harmony between the faculties is neither a case of efficient causation nor a case of a brute or primitive coincidence between reasons and choices, but relies on the deeper unity of the agent. Against the idea that the soul and its faculties constitute a composite entity endowed with a mere unity of aggregation, as an unum per aggregationem, as Suárez would have said, the underlying metaphysical unity of the soul is the central element of Suárez's conception of agent causes. And I will end here. Thank you.
Very much.